Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination, the show that envisions the alternatives and opportunities to build and transform a world along progressive goals and values, such as equality, peace, freedom, and radical love. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. And we meet on MNN every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. The show is repeated on MNN4 every Thursday, also at 8 p.m. And as always, we're so happy to have you here with us as we help each other build this new progressive world. The framework for a legislative foundation for a new American political and economic left during the last century was established more than 70 years ago. On January 11th, 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt, in his State of the Union address to Congress, referred to the need to implement a second Bill of Rights, economic and social rights to complement the political guarantees granted to us in our original Bill of Rights. He argued, quote, "We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. Needy men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. In our day, these economic truths have come to be accepted as evidence. We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, irregardless of station, race, or creed. Among these rights were 1. The right to a useful and remunerative job. 2. The right to a good education. 3. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies. 4. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. 5. The right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. 6. The right of every family to a decent home. And 7. The right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. Now, unable to achieve these legislative goals because of his death the following year, the Second Economic Bill of Rights remains the unfinished political and economic legacy of the New Deal. It's still the basis for the struggle for economic fairness and an end to poverty in the country. Another period of progressive legislation and spiritual creativity within the tradition of mass defiance and disruption also occurred in the 1960s. Principled civil disobedience and insurgent protest took many forms, including a December 4th, 1967 call by Dr. Martin Luther King for a Poor People's Campaign, transformative actions to end poverty. Despite his assassination and deep division in the country and movement, the mobilization of the poor went forward, but was cut short again as America turned rightward in the late 1960s, choosing to pursue and prolong the Vietnam War and seeking to roll back Great Society legislation and resources that had begun to be directed at the needs and interests of the great masses of the population. And over the last half-century, this backlash has continued, which has resulted in unprecedented poverty and hardship in the midst of unheard-of abundance, record inequality, nationally and around the world. In the United States, close to 50 million people, including 1 out of every 5 children, live in poverty, and another 100 million or so are officially designated as low income. This means that nearly 1 in every 2 people is poor, are low income, with most only an economic or health crisis away from joining them. But there are strong indications we are entering into a newer and stronger wave of progressive activism in the country. And my guest tonight is a major example of that struggle. He's been working for peace, justice, and human rights around the world for more than 4 decades. He's a graduate of Union Theological Seminary. He was executive director of Amnesty International USA from 2006 to 2011. And he is co-director of the Poverty Initiative and of Kairos, the Center on Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, which has been in the forefront of reaching out to partners and potential allies to move toward a new Poor People's Campaign that would coincide with the 50th anniversary of the one begun in 1967 by Reverend Martin Luther King. I've joined on to the movement, and we seek to learn from the past in order to create a transformative movement to abolish poverty in the United States that will also connect with other global movements. My guest for the evening is Larry Cox, someone who I've come to know only in the last couple of years, but who I feel I've known as a lifetime comrade and soulmate. Thank you so much, Larry, for being here tonight.
It's my pleasure.
So tell us, Larry, how did you get involved with Kairos, the Poverty Incentive? What was it in your background that led you to this sort of lifetime commitment of activism?
So do we have an hour to talk?
At least.
It's a long story,
well,
as you know.
We'll do 2 shows.
We're old people. But it goes back to my childhood. I grew up in Ohio to a single mother who had 2 other kids, and who, as I was growing up, I used to hear, as I lay in my bed in the same room as her, because we didn't have enough rooms, her crying because she couldn't pay her bills. And I knew, even as a kid, that nobody could work harder than my mother did. She was an accountant, but she worked from early in the morning to late at night. And yet here she was crying on a regular basis because she was terrified that we would lose the house, as we had already lost other homes. And so I knew something was fundamentally wrong. But I was living in a small town in Ohio where there was no signs of struggle going on, no hope. I didn't know how I could possibly do something that could alter that reality. And I knew it was not just a reality for her, but I knew it through reading that it was a reality for millions and millions and millions of people. Then 2 things happened to me that have influenced my life the rest of the way. One is that I, on my own, started reading one of the books that we had lying around, which was called the Bible. And there I discovered something which I really hadn't known, because it wasn't the Bible that I heard preached on the few occasions when I would go to church. Instead, it was the words talked about the obligation to serve the poor, and the fact that God was on the side of the poor in the struggle with the rich. So I thought, well, God, that's a pretty good ally to have in this fight. So that gave me hope. And the second thing was, and I don't think the first would have meant as much, if I hadn't been able to turn on the television and watch in those moments a real force in the world that embodied that spirit, that revolutionary spirit that I found in the New Testament. And that was, of course, Martin Luther King and the struggle for civil rights. To see millions of poor people organized, marching, moving, to me it was a sign that this was possible. And the only question was, how could I link up with that? How could I become part of the growing movements for social change that were just beginning to be born in the 50s and then really came to fruition in the early 60s. So that became the goal of my life. And I thought I was going to be a minister. I thought I would become a Methodist minister. That was my heritage. But I decided first I wanted to see the world. So I got into a church program that brought me to Paris, France, to learn French so that I could then go to West Africa and work.
This is after high school?
Yeah, after college.
So, after college?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So
I'd
you're-
already been in the anti-war movement in college and had been in the civil rights movement in college. But I really wanted to go out in the world. And this was in 1967, 1968.
Okay.
In 1968, I don't know how many people will know this who are listening, but it was, of course, a revolutionary year. My life was changed by another iconic figure in the civil rights movement, namely Stokely Carmichael, who came to Paris in December of 1967, gave a fiery speech, and fiery is the only word you could use with Stokely, saying nobody should be cooperating with the selective service system. So I went home after that speech and sent back my draft card and said, I'm not cooperating. I don't want my deferment. I'm not cooperating anymore. The second thing was, so the church didn't know what to do with me. They didn't want to send me to Africa, where the church was rather conservative. So I said, well, just let me stay here. I'll work with people like me, people who are deserters and draft resistors in Paris. And it was the time was a little crazy, so they allowed me to do that. And then in May of '68,
What would have happened if you came home? If you went back?
well,
to the
I would have
States?
gone.
You would have gone
I would have gone to
to
jail.
jail. Yeah.
So I stayed, and in May '68 there was a major upheaval in France. Really a revolution, almost a revolution. I mean, started with students, as often is the case, but it was joined by major labor strikes, and the whole country shut down. There were 2 or 3 days when there was literally nobody running the country. It felt like it was going to be a revolution. We had set up barricades, as happens in Paris. That's the tradition. It changed my whole way of thinking. It introduced me, of course, to revolutionary writers and thinkers, Marxism, which I had not really learned about, oddly enough, back in Avon Lake, Ohio, but which I learned in full when I was in Paris. And so I ended up not going into the ministry, but coming back and deciding that I would work for the revolution. And I did that as long as I could, not making any money, until about the mid-'70s, when two things were clear. One was that the revolution was not going to happen, at least not quickly. And the second was that
you were out of money.
I needed a job that actually paid some money.
Paid something.
I had worked for WBAI Radio, which paid only in promises and good wishes and good vibes, but that wasn't enough. And so I got a job with a little organization called Amnesty International back in 1976. And then I discovered yet another sort of revolutionary idea, and it relates very much to what you were just saying about Franklin Roosevelt. This was the idea of universal human rights, rights that were inherent in every human being. So it connected with my religious roots in the sense that these were not rights that came out from governments or came out from UN statements.
Mandates.
These were rights that were in human beings, that human beings discover when they're in struggle, when those rights are threatened. And among those rights, and this is really a legacy of Franklin Roosevelt's, and especially Eleanor Roosevelt, were economic and social rights. So in a sense, the U.S. is bound by economic and social rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has those same rights, often almost in the same language that Franklin Roosevelt used in his 1944 address, which has been mostly wiped clean from any history books or any history lessons, but which was very important. Those rights got embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They say that every human being has a human right to an income adequate to give them health and well-being.
This was in 1948.
1948.
Right? 48. So this is a few years after.
Yeah.
Roosevelt.
So, for decades, governments, the reason it passed is because it was after the Holocaust, it was after World War II. They wanted to make a statement, but they never thought anyone would take this seriously. And for decades, nobody did take it very seriously. When the movement started in the 50s and 60s, not only in the United States, but around the world, and of course, the anti-colonial movements, but also movements like the one that I had participated in France, but also in Mexico and other parts of the world, including, of course, Czechoslovakia. There was the beginning of a real movement again but this time a movement for human rights, demanding, and the governments take seriously those words. And I got involved in that. The irony was that the way that the human rights movement had structured itself, it was primarily concerned about human rights in other countries and not in the United States. And it did take up, at least the organization that I belonged to, did not take up economic and social rights. So in a way, I got separated from what was really the driving force in me, which was to do something about the condition I'd seen my mother in.
Right.
To work only on behalf, very important work, on behalf of civil and political rights, but not on economic and social rights. So I did that for many years, and when I eventually got a job by some bizarre accident at the Ford Foundation, where I was finally able to give away other people's money, very wonderful job to have, incidentally, I started to push to give that money to groups that were trying to apply human rights to the United States of America, and especially economic and social rights. No, because there had been a deliberate effort by the U.S. government. On the one hand, Eleanor Roosevelt had played a heroic role in getting these rights proclaimed at the UN in Paris in 1948. But at the same time, to get that declaration accepted by the U.S. government, they had to deal with the Southern Democrats, who were, adamantly opposed and fearful that someone would take seriously these rights and apply them to, like, the lynchings that were going on every week in the South, or the denial of equal opportunity for people of color. So there had to be deal making in which they more or less were assured that they would make sure that these rights did not get applied to the United States of America. It's a long story. There's a wonderful book called Eyes Off the Prize by Carol Anderson, which explains in detail how the United States succeeded in insulating itself from the rights that were proclaimed in 1948. And part of the battle that I began when I was at the Ford Foundation, joined by many, many other people involved in struggles, was to reclaim those rights for the United States. And that's what I tried to do. And in the process, I also began to look at social movements, because it was clear to me that the only reason governments had ever taken seriously human rights, the words on the page or the documents, was because there was a social movement that forced them to do that. It may not have been strong enough to make the kind of revolution that I once dreamed about, but it was strong enough to force them to at least respond, to claim, oh yes, we are trying, oh yes, without that force, those words become empty.
After the Holocaust and after World War II, so that was the impetus.
Yeah, the only reason that governments ever took it seriously was because of the upheaval in the 60s around the world, and they suddenly said, oh, we better do that. So I suddenly realized that one of the reasons the human rights movement was losing power was because it had lost its connection to social movements, lost its connection to struggles that were going on, and it had become more or less a kind of professionalized, NGOized, academic kind of discipline. Career instead of a movement. A career instead of a movement. And I was part of that. So this is a self-criticism. It's not just a criticism of other people.
When did you realize that you had become so part of that?
Well, in my sort of second term as director of Amnesty International again, I suddenly realized that something, because I was trying to rekindle the kind of movement part of the human rights enterprise, and I suddenly realized that the only way to do that would be to get involved, to break out of the human rights bubble that had been created, or human rights fences that had been created. Say, these are human rights organizations. Those are not human rights organizations because they don't talk about, first and foremost, human rights. They talk about social justice. So I tried to break out of that. We had a very successful campaign that we did at the end of that, involved with Troy Davis, who was on death row in Georgia, in which we were able to connect with the NAACP and begin to produce what looked like a social movement and grab the imagination, I think, of people all over the country, indeed all over the world, to see that the death penalty in this case, in all cases, but particularly in this case, was a deep moral wrong. So that reawakened an interest on my part in social movements, and I began to reconnect with people who were also trying to build a social movement, some of which were at Union Theological Seminary. Two people that I admire greatly, Liz Teo Harris and Willie Baptist, had come out of the Kensington Welfare Rights Union, which was a movement of low-income people, poor people, that had been very successful in some ways in mobilizing and building protests. Willie had also had an incredible record of organizing the homeless. And they were trying to rebuild the kind of social movement that could bring an end to poverty, which was the only way that they saw it possible to bring an end to poverty. The fact that these words that I just quoted from the Universal Declaration existed meant nothing
just
unless
words.
there was a social movement to say,
Behind it.
you committed to this, you better do it, or else we'll make sure that you have to do it. So
you weren't kidding when you said you're going to need more than an hour on it. No,
but I'm at the end.
No,
I'm
no,
at the
no,
end.
No, but you've taken an incredible tour
Yeah.
in just a few minutes here. Incredible tour of so much that was going on in America, around the world, and the different influences of media pressures of organizing and so on. No, continue.
Just one other element that's
No,
missing, and then
very
we
important.
can.
Very important.
Which was that in looking at social movements, looking at my own life,
Right.
I rediscovered the importance of what there's a lot of different terms for it, but what I would call faith. When you work with people who are poor, they don't have resources, obviously. That's why they're poor. They don't have economic resources. One resource that they do have is faith. And they do have a connection to some kind of feeling that there's a transcendent power in the universe that is on their side. You know, Martin Luther King used to say, you know, the arc of the universe, bends slowly, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah.
And that was not just words. Those were words that people feel, especially when they're poor. It's what gives them the sense that they can go on despite all of the hardship.
But you would agree not all poor people have that vision. I mean,
Well,
they can also, many may think it's fatalism or there's not much you can do in this world.
It takes a lot of different forms.
Right.
But I would say
Right.
that if you work with poor communities, you know, religion is just a constant.
Okay.
It may take different forms. It's a constant and it's a force. And I've seen that force in my lifetime make all the difference. It's not dogmatic religion. It's not necessarily organized religion, but it's this sense that and even in so-called secular movements, if you look back in the 30s, you look at, you know, sort of communist movements and so on, socialist movements, people had a sense that, well, you know, I may not live to see this victory, but there's something that's bigger than me that's going on here. There's a spirit that's going on here that motivates us all, keeps us, connects, and so on.
Yeah, okay.
So I became interested in what had happened to that dimension of social movements. And that took me back to Union Theological Seminary to actually study religion, the religious power. Because it's very clear, especially in our time, we see a lot of manifestations of religious power which are totally negative. You know, the right sort of understood this better than the left, to be blunt about it, and grabbed onto religious power and used it as a tool against liberation, against people who were oppressed, trying to overthrow their oppression. Used it to reinforce the violation of women's rights, of gay rights, you gave a fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of words that were written thousands or even longer years ago, and used those words to put down poor people and to put down, rather than to embody them. So they had gotten a monopoly on that, and we see that, and we see it today, of course, in similar attempts to take over Islam and make Islam not a voice of liberation, but a voice of intolerance. So I went back to Union thinking, I have to understand how the kind of faith that had fed me and led me to believe that it was possible against all odds to make revolutionary change, how can that faith be unleashed again in people? And that's probably what the Kairos Center was set up to do, to look at how we can create social movements that can draw on, that are not religious movements, but that can draw on the power of religion, the power of human rights, the power of social justice, the power of social thinking, like Marxist thinking, could draw on all of that to build the kind of movements that will have the power to transform the kind of world we live in, the kind of world that you called for in your introduction.
Right.
Create that world.
Yeah, yeah. So, God, struck by so many things you've been saying. No, seriously.
Sorry about that.
No, it's wonderful.
You should never ask an old person to tell his story.
Cornell said the same thing. We've got many, many years. We've got to see this revolution through. So we've got time here to do this.
Yeah.
No, but I'm struck by so many things. First of all, this was so natural radicalization by you at such a deep, profound level as you experienced what was going on in your home there. And so this is not some sort of intellectualized adventure for you. And then the moving to Paris to begin to realize how this is an international movement, or can be. And that was very important, I think, for you to have done that, to get outside of the States at that time. And I want to go back to that, your statement about picking up another Bible, or this Bible that really spoke to you. I mean, there were, it's the same Bible, right?
Yeah,
But what were you reading? You were reading passages that not fed is not the word, that stuck with you, that made sense to you more than the retributive, punitive, whatever you want to call the other parts of the Bible might be. So this, how did that happen? How did this?
Well, it wasn't hard, because the truth of the matter is, and there are fortunately a growing number of sort of what I would call really the prophets of our time, like Cornel West, but also like William Barber from North Carolina, who are pointing this out all the time. The passage that the right focuses on, well, first of all, sometimes there aren't even passages, but they imply that somehow the Bible is writing all the time about homosexuality, for example, or it's writing all the time about abortion. You won't find any passage in the Bible about abortion. You'll find a few isolated passages based on very incomplete medical science about homosexuality. But you will find thousands. You will find thousands of passages, literally thousands of passages, about the poor and about the oppressed.
The other. And
so it was not. It's not like I had to search. It's like it's there. If you read it fresh. I mean, what saved me was that I, as a child, didn't go to church very often. My mother, who, as I say, was poor, had felt that the churches had not helped her when she needed help. And so she, although she was the daughter of a Methodist minister, she didn't go to church very often.
What does that mean? They didn't help her in terms of...
She went to them, she was a divorced woman without much money, and she went to them and they would sort of lecture her about, you shouldn't be divorced, you shouldn't be, they made her feel unwanted because she was, in those days, divorce would be a little bit like, later on it was sort of living in sin, but just being divorced was scandalous.
So her poverty, in a sense, was somehow tied into some sort of individual character.
Well, this is a very familiar theme, as we know about poverty, that the poor are always blamed for themselves. So if she had, been a better wife, maybe she wouldn't be so poor because she'd still be with a husband, and the husband, I mean, it's all of this. So she didn't really understand that totally, although she communicated it to me.
She understood it at a gut level.
At a very gut level.
Not right.
And she understood that somehow the organized churches, the organized religion, was not her friend. And indeed they weren't. I mean, I didn't remember hearing any, until I turned on the television and saw King standing in a pulpit talking about the God of justice and the God of, the God that lifts up the oppressed, the God that fights for the oppressed. So, so I didn't have the experience of being taught a bad religion. Wasn't taught any religion. When I opened the book and read it, just as like I would read any book, it just, these passages, because they're all over the place, leapt out at me. A rich man, is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man. Give everything you have to the poor. There's a scene in Matthew about how you will be judged. Did you feed me? Did you visit me? Not did you say prayers or hosannas. What did you do to help the poor? And the very opening of the story is about, and then if you go into the prophets, Isaiah and Micah and all these prophets, those words just leap out at you. So to me, it was a revelation. I remember sitting in my little shabby bedroom reading this stuff and going, wow, this is not what I have been
How old
taught.
were you at that time?
I was probably, 12 or 13.
And then remembering that and going to Union at what age?
Oh, I didn't start going to Union until I was in my 50s. So it was a long stretch.
Long stretch, but that always was there.
Well, it was there in every part of, I mean, I never
life.
actually stopped myself feeling this connection to some kind
Right.
of transcendent power. But it's just how that power manifests itself. And it's, not to get too theological on you, but the question is, because people have, this is we're going to have a different show to discuss sometime, religion, because the way it's been ruined is that people have this idea, and you'll see this on shows like, Bill Maher's show or whatever, that religion is a belief in some kind of magical super being who sits on a cloud or sits somewhere and, takes worries about whether you've, fornicated and if you're good and ask him for things, you'll get. I mean, it's this kind of child's version of religion. Whereas, what it's really about is this feeling of being connected, that there's some moral order in the universe. And that when we don't live up to that moral order, things go badly for all
And you're
human
not
beings.
doing God's will.
Yeah,
and not
that's what it
experiencing
means.
God's
So the
love.
question is,
Who enters into
how
the
does that?
world
How do you
way?
find that spirit, that sort of force that I'm talking about? And
Sounds very
90% of the time, it's not in churches, and it's not in synagogues, and it's not in mosques even. It's often in the streets, and that's what I found. I mean, some of the most deeply religious experiences I had were on the streets of Paris, building barricades with people singing, the International. That to me was where I found God, and it still is. I mean, we just spent an incredible week with workers for Walmart, which is, in my opinion, the epitome of what's wrong with this society and our world. We have 6 members of the Walmart family whose combined income, is greater than the combined income of 43% of the American people. I mean, just think about that. And
What do you think they're thinking about? How do they justify that, rationalize it? Are they doing God's will too?
Yes. Well, this is where the battle over religion is parallel and can't be separated from the battle over social justice.
Right.
Because
Right.
their version, and you'll see this if you turn on television,
Right.
is a sort of prosperity gospel. And this is
you
a
see
very
that with Trump.
Yeah. I'm great.
rich.
God loves me. I'm living the good life because I'm making billions of dollars. This is the proof. And you'll hear pastors, you'll hear people like this Joel Osteen or somebody on television talking about it like that. Like it's, God wants you to be rich and prosperous. Now, that's a message that you can put out. It's just not the message you'll find in any of the religious traditions. This is a heretical idea.
Right.
It's the opposite of what the message is of Judaism, Christianity, Islam.
And the message of Christ's life.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Right.
And one of the reasons that
And you don't have to be religious to
we
see
now
that.
find
Yeah.
people responding the way they have responded to the Pope
Right.
is because they're here and they act like, wow, this is like a new thing. All he's doing is actually saying the words that Jesus said and trying to live up to those words and saying we should live up to those words. And people take it like, because it is. They haven't heard this. They haven't seen it. Like a revolutionary idea.
And it could be the sign of a new wave of progressive activism that we haven't really seen since the 60s.
Well,
Black
this is
Lives Matter,
the
etc.
Yeah, and this gets us to why, which you were kind enough not to ask, but why we call ourselves the Kairos Center,
Right.
because Kairos is a very important word. First of all, you're Greek, so it's one of those wonderful old Greek words that we owe so much to the Greeks for, which meant a time of sort of that calls for decisive action.
The crumbling of the old order.
Well,
yes, possibly.
in biblical terms, It came to mean a time when the old ways are
Right.
falling apart,
Right.
no longer work, and where in that moment something new,
Right.
in the religious term, something eternal, is trying to break into the temporal world in which we live and give us a vision. It's really what kindles what you call the radical imagination. There's just something new breaking in. Now,
Right.
it doesn't happen always. It doesn't happen every year. It doesn't happen every decade. I think it was
Exactly.
what was going on in the 60s.
Absolutely,
Things
yeah.
were crumbling, things were falling apart, and there was this sense that something new was trying to be born. And there were prophets who represented it, both secular and religious prophets who talked about this. I felt like we then went into the desert, to use another religious metaphor, for a long time, more than, almost, 40
Absolutely.
years.
Yeah.
Wandering in the desert, hoping to find, the way again. And then, when things began to happen like Occupy, which was a kind of
Again,
sudden
resurgence.
moment, like an
Yeah.
awakening. Like people
yeah.
suddenly saying, whoa, look at this world. Look at the world we're in.
Right.
This is unacceptable. We don't have to live like this. That was what it was about. It wasn't really a movement yet. It wasn't organized well enough to last as a movement, but it was a powerful awakening. The Arab Spring, the same. And nobody could figure these things out. But suddenly there was something going on. And what we're seeing and what we're counting on and what's the hope for a new poor people's movement is the fact that there are struggles like that going on all over the country and all over the world. Most of them are not in the headlines. Some are when they reach a certain size. So the uprising against the killings of people of color. I think that's a powerful movement. The Fight for 15 is another movement that breaks into the headlines. The Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina. Occasionally, the media is forced to let people see it. But if you travel around, as we're doing now, in an attempt to build a Poor People's Campaign, you come across these struggles with people fighting these heroic battles. Often, they feel very, sort of isolated, and they're hungry to somehow connect.
Is that what you're
other
doing
struggles.
too at the Kairos Center there? You're trying to establish the links and show the connections and get people to be more unified
Exactly.
in a much deeper, profound way.
Yeah, exactly.
So that perhaps as this movement takes place again, it will last, and we'll, as we were saying before the show, we'll get it right.
The key,
right
the key
time.
program in the
Well, yeah,
Kairos
tell us
Center
a little about it.
is called the Poverty Initiative, and it
Okay.
existed before the Kairos Center did.
Right.
For about a decade, people like Willie Baptist and
Right.
Liz and other people there, wonderful people, the best people I've ever come across, were struggling with trying to understand how they could end poverty. And their analysis was that the only hope to end poverty would be to build a real social movement, because it's not like the powers that be, the Waltons, who in Walmart are going to suddenly say, oh, we feel terrible, let's just restructure our economy. There is a class that benefits from the current economic system, and they're going to hold on to those benefits. So you have to create a movement powerful enough to challenge that. And you can't just will it into existence.
Some might willingly give some of their wealth.
Yeah.
But far and few between.
No,
right?
but
The
I mean,
Bill Gates-
nor
and
can
that-
you as an activist suddenly
Right.
just decide, this is the moment when we can create this. There has to be a connection of the subjective and the objective coming together. There's certain moments when suddenly it's possible to really think seriously about revolutionary transformation. And I would argue that we're entering, if not already into, such a
Right.
moment. All those examples I gave are signs of that. But
as you
it
say-
doesn't just happen
Yeah.
spontaneously. It didn't
No,
happen,
right.
and it can be stopped, and it has been stopped. I mean, the Arab Spring was smashed deliberately by...
And so was Occupy.
And Occupy
Literally.
was stopped by also both internal problems, but also mainly by the fact that the state cracked down and took away their land. I mean, the place they had occupied. So we've got to begin to build the kind of unity that can't be destroyed easily, and can't be. And also, we've got to create leaders, many leaders, so that the assassination of one or two leaders will also not stop the movement. I mean, there's no doubt that the assassination of King was a major factor in making his attempt, because in December of 1967, he announced that he was going to launch a poor people's movement, precisely because he understood that none of the things he had been fighting for were really going to be meaningful or realized unless you could deal with economic injustice.
And working outside the system, because he also had, right, a choice to possibly run for president, to do things within the system. He chose not to.
No, he was someone who took quite seriously, as seriously as any human being has ever taken, this sort of moral, in his case, biblical obligation to be with the poor, to identify with the poor, to fight for the poor. And he didn't see that happening by running for office. He saw it literally by trying to organize the poor and dispossessed, bring them together, and then into a unified force, what he called a new and unsettling force.
New unsettling force. Now, fast forward, we're 2017 now. What happens? There's a unity, there are these decentralized groups joining together, we're seeing the link. Take us a little further.
Well, two things are very important. One is that
nonviolence,
we're not in, well, of course, but we're not in 1968. One of the differences between now and 1968 is that in 68, you had, a class, what they used to call the underclass, what really just meant the lower working class or the unemployed working class, that was not moving up. But you had a middle class which was actually getting better. The economy was working, and it was they were felt like, well, we're going to climb up. So it was easier to divide the people who were being left behind from people who thought, no, I'm going to make it. I don't have to identify with these people who have been left behind. And it was, of course, built on racism as well. So many of the people being left behind, not by no means all. There were many poor white people being left behind, but many of the people were left behind were people of color, and that was used very deliberately to separate them out. But that was back in 1968. Yeah, the Southern strategy.
Political strategy. Okay.
Today, as you pointed out, you have nobody except a very tiny, minuscule almost, percentage of people who are doing spectacularly well. I mean, like the Waltons, but less than 1%. Not even the 1%.
Not even that.
A tiny percentage of 1%. And you have most people, the vast majority of people, who haven't seen any rise in their income in decades, and are just, as you said, one economic disaster or health problem away from entering into poverty. So you have nearly half the population, which is either officially poor, which is very poor, or low income, which is on the edge of falling into poverty.
But again, the problem concretely becomes money, how to distribute it, right? Resources, capital. You're familiar with Clower and Piven's attempt to organize and mobilize the welfare recipients to bring about a fiscal political crisis that would then hopefully lead to a guaranteed annual income.
I remember it well.
Okay. Is there anything along those lines, or how are you going to concretize this, or try to? I know this is
this is a very important principle of what we're trying to do, which is that I don't think it depends on what the we is. How are we going to concretize it? We're trying to learn from the struggles that are going on. What are the demands? What are people? Because the other thing we're trying to break down, I mean, there are all kinds of stereotypes that are used to keep this kind of unity from taking place. And one is that, poor people are the problem. I mean, they're the problem because they're poor because they're the problem. I mean, they're pathetic. They have all these personal problems, as if, rich people are healthy and well and really have no problems, and poor people are poor because they have a lot of problems. As we all know, the only difference between rich people and poor people is that when rich people have problems, they can take time off and go to a fancy hospital or
Betty
spa
Ford
or
clinic
whatever
or
they
whatever.
want to
Right,
get
right.
fixed up. Poor
Right,
people
right.
can't do that.
Right.
So there are a lot of problems with poor people, but they're no different. And also that poor people are not very smart. And this is another thing which people who work with poor people know is untrue. Know that in fact they may not have been given the kind of education that you get at John Jay College or Princeton or remember, but they have learned a lot from their struggles and know a lot and know how the economy really works and have in some ways fewer illusions than people who
like
are
your mother,
like my mother, who was a very smart woman and was poor, and so we want to learn from those people what are the needs they have. We know, and we have people, economists, well-trained, who point this out much more effectively than I can, that there's an abundance of wealth. The problem is not scarcity. The problem is not that we don't have enough, so only some can have a decent life and others just can't. I mean, because there's not enough to go around. We know that that's not true.
Right.
We know, in fact, that the problem is that we have an economic system which operates as if, there is scarcity. But in fact, the real problem is it can't handle, doesn't know what to do with abundance. So we will have to figure out demands. We will have to figure out, when I say we, I mean this movement will have to figure out demands.
the grassroots.
The grassroots movement will
People
have to figure
themselves,
out
right.
what are the demands we can make that will move us closer to the transformation of an economy that is no longer based on the idea of private profit being the highest goal, and will instead talk about some kind of system which gives people first their most basic needs.
Sounds like you still are obviously going to have to work with the system as it's presently structured.
There's no magical way to get from
putting
where we are.
We're back on putting those sorts of.
No. What we want to do is make demands that will increase the power of working people and people who are unable to find work, poor people, and dispossessed people, and the people that we've just been talking about, or the vast majority of people, will increase their power and will decrease the ability of the small minority. It's a tiny minority that benefits from the system as it is now. And as that happens, things that at the moment don't seem possible. Very little seems possible at the moment. Even the most simple thing, a minimum wage of $15 an hour is still regarded by some people as some outlandish demand, even though in real terms, when you look at where the minimum wage was, you realize that we're way behind. If it had just kept up with inflation, it would be much higher than it is. So,
if I could just, are you also working in some ways with the Sanders campaign? Do you find that can be somewhat of, that movement be part of this?
I think the Sanders campaign,
larger movement,
and in some ways even the Trump campaign, are both signs of the possibilities. By that I mean that obviously Sanders is putting forward ideas and is attracting people who recognize that this system, as he says, the system as it is unsustainable. We cannot go on like this.
So he's a natural ally.
He's absolutely a natural ally.
Does he add that moral dimension that you've been?
Well, I think he could have help.
More of that.
I think he needs help. And I think and this is where I think King was right not to get involved in electoral politics. I think electoral politics are very important, but I think the role that we see the Poor People's Campaign playing is pushing whoever gets elected, and I personally wish it were Bernie Sanders, but whoever gets elected, pushing them and pushing others in Congress to make possible what now seems not possible.
And I think Reverend Barber puts it so well. This is not about the left or the right, or Democrats, Republicans.
That's precisely what I mean.
Exactly.
It's about putting forward the kind of moral vision, which is what King did.
Right.
And he literally, you see it now in the attempts of of the Republicans to sort of capture King and remake him in the image of someone. Oh, you know, King was in favor of free enterprise, and King
disinfect, and
which is not true.
Santa Claus sort of image.
Yeah. You know, King had a very radical analysis of the economy. He understood that capitalism, you know.
He was a democratic socialist.
He was a democratic socialist.
And he announced that to Coretta, his future wife, on their first
He
date.
was probably more of a democratic socialist than Bernie is, actually.
Absolutely.
And that was partly because of the time in which he lived. It was possible to talk about that.
Yeah, you brought that up again because, and then you said a few minutes ago too, this is not 1968, although both of us wish we could go back there, at least for a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, you're absolutely right, not 1968, but the same issues are there, even more disastrous. Since we haven't handled it, we haven't dealt with it. Backlash. So we've learned from the 60s, and what you're trying to tell us about the inline program that you're offering here are ways that people can get involved, our audience could get more involved in some of the efforts that you're involved in.
Well, the first thing to do would be to get in touch with us at the Kairos Center.
Okay. At Union.
Yeah, kairoscenter.org.
Okay.
And that will connect them. And we want people to join, but we can also connect people to struggles that are going on that are part of this Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign is going to be made up of thousands of organizations.
It's like a clearinghouse.
Yeah.
In a sense.
We're just trying to be a catalyst, actually, to get it started.
I see.
We're going around the country. We're talking to grassroots organizations, some of them large, like the Moral Mondays movement, some of them not so large. And we're trying to begin to get people, because it's very hard, as you know, to get people to think about unity, to get people to break out, especially in this age of NGOs and foundation funding.
Of the apathy, the co-optation, the fear that people have.
But once people get, once people use their radical imagination, which is a very good term. I think imagination has to be reborn for us to create a different kind of world.
And you're adding this dimension of moral courage, which I'm sorry, as you know, much of the left does not get. They have not really understood that is an absolute crucial part of this. Larry, we're going to have to do another show here because we are running out of time very fast here. And in conclusion, wrapping up the 60s and on, traditionally in America, the causes of poverty, as Larry has said, were seen as individual failure, residing in the characteristics of the poor themselves: ignorance, lack of training, addiction, laziness, alcoholism, poor character, sexual promiscuity, too many children, etc., etc., etc. Remedies and policies included evangelical religion, temperance legislation, punitive conditions for relief, forced breakup of families, prisons, including debtors' prisons, threats of institutionalization, broken windows, stop and frisk, all done with the idea of improving poor people and changing their so-called unacceptable behavior, administering the harsh but necessary medicine for their own good. And that's a quote actually from Police Chief Bratton. He points that out time and time again when he talks about broken windows. Philanthropy and charity tax write-offs were and are still used as rationalizations by the rich, exercises for them to exorcise their own moral guilt, and again, to couch the problem as one of uplifting and elevating the character of poor people. This shouldn't be surprising in a nation so strongly committed to the ethos of individualism. The radical imagination sees it quite differently. Again, as Larry has pointed out, the resources and capital are there and do exist so that no individual, adult or child, need suffer from want in the world. There simply is no political, economic, psychological, philosophical, intellectual, or moral justification for impoverishment in the world today. Absolutely no reason at all for it to exist. And certainly human brain power can figure out any possible technical issue of resource distribution or allotment that might occur as we work toward a fair distribution of the economic pie. No individual or group needs serve as a scapegoat so that others can humiliate them and exploit them to justify, rationalize, and enjoy their own privileged status. The Poor People's Campaign of 1967, the welfare rights movement of the 60s and 70s, which mobilized the welfare poor onto the welfare rolls, creating a fiscal and political crisis in the hopes of bringing about a guaranteed annual income for all, and the building of a new Poor People's Campaign today by Kairos and the Poverty Initiative, are exactly the sort of moral movements needed that can finally put an end to the scourge of economic need, hunger, and poverty in the country and in the world. I agree with Larry. The problem ultimately is a moral one, that of greed. To deny or rationalize that poverty is not, at least in part, a moral issue, is to prolong the solving of the problem. As Dr. King put it, I came here tonight to say that America, too, is going to hell if we don't use her wealth. If America does not use her vast resources of wealth to end poverty, to make it possible for all of God's children to have their basic necessities of life, she too will go to hell. Aristotle puts it in a more secular way. In a democracy, the poor will have more power than the rich because there are more of them, and the will of the majority is supreme. The poor need to reclaim their humanity, and with the new Poor People's Campaign, it can happen. And with the efforts of my comrade and my guest tonight, Larry Cox, it will happen. So thank you all so very much for joining us tonight. This is your host, Jim Vrettos, hoping to see you next Sunday evening at 8 p.m. for another experience of the radical imagination.